We still have a few more folks trickling in, but I think we'll get started with an introduction to our speaker today. So I'm really excited to have Dr. Matilda Gibbons with us here. Dr. Gibbons got her PhD with Lars Chicka at Queen Mary University London and is now a postdoctoral scholar in the Geffen Lab at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. In the Chicka lab, she was working on sentience and the potential for pain in bumblebees. And now for her postdoc, she's looking at the neural basis of consciousness in mammals, specifically looking at mice. And so today I'm just going to hand things over to Tilda here. But if you have any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A below. You should have a little tab at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. You can write your questions in there, and then I'll ask any questions of Tilda that we have time for at the end of the talk today. And so with that, I will turn things over to our speaker.
Cool. All right. Thank you, Megan. I will share now. Okay. So today I'm basically going to share an idea that I'm working on for a review sort of type of piece. It's sort of in the beginning stages. So I am using this to sort of flesh it out. And so any feedback would be greatly appreciated. But yeah, basically, there's not going to be too much experimental data in this talk. But this idea for this review has basically come from my work in animal sentience and in the consciousness field. Like Megan just said, I am currently working with mice and I have worked with insects before, both on the topic of sentience for both. And so in working in both of those fields, I've sort of come to see a difference in the attitudes towards why we're looking for sentience and the assumptions made. So this is the sort of basic aim for this review and the basic idea. So the talk structure today is basically just going to be an introduction, and then I'm going to talk through the current approach to how we are attributing sentience and the motivations behind that. Then I'm going to basically define these two routes that I think are kind of emerging in the field. And then I'm going to talk about the implementation of the sort of ideas I have to make these more distinct, and then the future directions. So first of all, to introduce, I think a lot of this audience probably already knows the basics. I won't go into it too much, but the importance of sentience and what sentience is. So in this talk specifically, I'm going to be referring to sentience and consciousness in sort of the same way. But sentience is basically the capacity to have subjective experiences. So this can be things that feel bad or feel a certain way, feel good or bad or a certain way to an agent. And the other thing is this whole review is going to be based on just any sort of agent that we might want to attribute sentience to or assess sentience in. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to try and focus on insects as much as I can. The basic principles apply. So sentience is the capacity to have subjective experience. So there's something it feels like to be that agent, whether this is like be able to be thirsty or hungry or have pain and pleasure. And at the moment, we can't measure it directly. So this is what this figure is basically showing, that you can see the outside world, something happens in the brain, and then we have a conscious percept. And we don't really know what's going on specifically in the brain at this time. Obviously, we have some idea and research is looking into this, but at the moment there isn't, if this neuron fires, we know that they are feeling this particular way. And so it's not directly measurable, even in another human at this point. Again, I'm sure most of you already know this, but just going through the basics. So attributing sentience is important to us as a society, obviously for example, with our pets and veterinary care, we want to know whether a dog can feel pain and how we can reduce that pain, and how we can make it have the best life if we want it to have the best life. We need to know how it's feeling. Same in other industries like zoos. We want to be able to give the animal the enrichment that it needs, and we need to know whether it's able to be feeling that enrichment or be feeling the negative effects of not having that enrichment. And same in research, ethics-wise, if we're doing invasive procedures, we need to be able to know whether the animal is feeling that, also how to reduce it, but also just in a sort of scientific knowledge sense, intrinsically, it's an important thing for us to know which animals and which agents are sentient. So, as I was saying, my background has sort of led me to this idea for a review or for a piece. And it's basically from realizing the inconsistencies in different types of sentience or consciousness research. So for my PhD, these are a couple papers and couple studies I was doing. So I was basically looking at whether insects can feel pain. So using neural and behavioral indicators to look at insects and specifically bees for my empirical studies. Um, and the overall approach basically was taking potential indicators of sentience and seeing whether insects fulfill them. And this work was, received in lots of different ways. In general, fairly controversial. It's a sort of new question to be asking, and there's a lot of sort of not backlash, but a lot of people disagree. And the barrier for saying that an insect is feeling something is a lot higher socially than for mammals. And I've realized this even more since working with mice now. So at the moment, I'm doing my postdoc at Penn, and I'm using mice, looking at theories of consciousness that have mainly been developed for human consciousness or based on human consciousness, the global workspace and the integrated information theory. So I won't go too much into what I'm actually doing, but very basically, it's using mice and non-human primates as models for humans and then doing things that we can't do to humans to figure out the neuronal correlates of consciousness based within the framework of these two theories. And so I've got this quote up from my PI to basically just show, she's saying, this is explaining our project. She's saying that we're looking at the propagation of the sensory signal as part of the consciousness framework. We're analyzing the neuronal activity while those stimuli are consciously perceived, but not when they're responded to by the mouse. And the main reason I have this quote up is because I want to show how acceptable it is to just say that the mouse is obviously consciously perceiving something. And this is, scientifically, we are assuming consciousness in the mouse. And this was quite a big difference. This was quite a big transition for me, coming from asking whether insects can feel pain or be conscious, and then just assuming that mice are. And not there isn't really the same sort of scientific rigor in how do we know that? How are we proving that? And yet it was just kind of accepted. And when people ask me about my PhD, there is a lot of, yeah, but surely not because of this, but surely not because of this, and a lot of things that are evidence that wouldn't be used in the same way against mice, if that makes sense. So this is sort of the motivation of how this came about. On the flip side, I also found it's quite hard to be scientific when you're studying sentience because, for example, this is a paper I published during my PhD. It was, again, I won't go too much into like what the study was actually doing, but it was basically looking at behavioral indicator of sentience. So this is something that could potentially be related to sentience that they might do if they are sentient, if they're able to feel pain. And in my conclusion, or in our conclusion, we basically tried to express this uncertainty in the question because obviously we can't directly measure pain. There is no behavioral indicator that equals pain. And so we wrote that it's consistent with the capacity to feel pain as in other animals. So if another animal were to do this, you might think that they're feeling pain if another animal, such as a mouse or a dog. Although because of the subjective nature, it's not formal proof. And this is our way of trying to be like, we know that this isn't, don't take this to mean that they absolutely feel pain. But it is hard to get this balance right because the implications of this work could potentially be huge ethically. So you obviously have to consider that too. And it's a very difficult balance to strike. And, even when you're being kind of conservative, like I have done here, you then get picked up by the media and said bees can almost certainly feel pain according to science. So, I mean, they put the almost in to maybe try and express some uncertainty, but I think this reads fairly like bees feel pain, which is obviously not what I was trying to say. But it is hard to express this sort of uncertainty because I think a lot of the public and people that are making legislation believe that there is a way or have never really thought about it too much, but they think that there is a way to prove sentience. I've had so many people say to me, like, have you proved bees feel pain? And things like that. And I try to explain to them that it's impossible. And I try to explain the fact that it's impossible even in humans. And it doesn't really land. I think most people are under the impression that, yeah, but there's some threshold they cross. Like it's obvious that dogs feel pain or whatever. So it's just a hard thing to express. But so how are we doing it at the moment? So in general, I'm talking from society and from legislation, just a very generalized view. We basically take a mixed approach, and this obviously depends on the law and the culture and the context, but lots of things come into it. And here's a list that's not exhaustive, but there's lots of things such as the similarity to a human, whether this is neurally or behaviorally. And then there are other things that come into it, like intelligence and cuteness and how much we like them, how much we interact with them. And I've just got an example here of my cat grooming her face. And in this example, this is kind of to show that familiarity and maybe cuteness comes into our decision making a lot, in the way that you probably can imagine what it feels like to be her doing that to her face and cleaning her face. But then when you look at the fruit fly doing the same thing, it might not it might not give you the same sort of, oh yeah, I know how that fruit fly feels trying to clean off its mouth parts there. And maybe when it's slowed down like this and zoomed in, it's a little bit easier to see. But especially in real life, if you were to see this on the real size, probably wouldn't instigate the same thing. So these are real things that we have as humans to either get over or acknowledge. But at the moment, these things are coming into play quite a lot in how we're assessing sentience, and doesn't necessarily mean that we know that the cat is feeling something more similar to us. So, on that note, I think that there's basically, if we were to take it down to the very core parts of it, I think that there are really two motivations behind why we need to assess sentience. So the first really conservative take is we just need to know for science. So there's scientific knowledge, scientific gain. So just to know whether the agent is sentient or not, 100% certain whether they are or not. And so this could be because we want to learn more about the neural mechanisms or the evolutionary mechanisms. So for example, with mice, we might, for scientific knowledge purpose, just want to know whether mice are conscious, just like we might want to know whether they can hear, whether they can see. And not because we want to use their hearing or their seeing, but because we're just interested. And then maybe we can use them as a model organism, or we can just learn more about the evolutionary mechanisms behind what they have. But the point is here, this purpose is you need to kind of know 100% whether the agent is sentient. But the societal purpose, which is what I'm basically referring to, this complex sort of mixed approach, is really not to know 100% whether the agent is sentient, but it's to know how we should feel about them, how we should treat them, how we should interact with them. And this is like the examples I gave earlier with research in veterinary practice and zoos. How do we form legal protections? Should we form legal protections? Should we give them treatment? Should we just personally try not to hurt them, try not to kill them? Should we care about them? And so I think we all kind of implicitly know the difference between these two, and we just haven't really properly spelled it out. And that is the theme of this talk, really. I think a lot of the researchers in animal sentience and in consciousness probably know the distinctions here, but the public and legislation doesn't have such of a clear idea. So animal sentience work usually is basically trying to fulfill this societal purpose, but scientifically, and that's where it comes into difficulties. So I've got an example here of a different kind of capacity that we might assess in an agent. And so I've got hearing as an example. So the basic, and with how these two motivations would come into it. So there's, for scientific knowledge gain, we might just want to know whether an animal can hear just because we want to know. Like, it's interesting, we might want to know how dolphins have evolved to have this particular frequency range of hearing. But importantly, that knowledge won't be to do with anything that we're going to be treating them for or knowing about how to influence them. But the societal purpose for hearing might be so that we know what ultrasonic frequencies not to play around pets or something along those lines, something that involves how we relate to them. So obviously, sentience research comes into a problem here because we don't have this way of getting the scientific knowledge. So for hearing, for example, we can do actual experiments where we assume that if they're responding in, and we know enough about the auditory pathway in humans and in mammals, and how these functionally relate to these other animals, then we are able to find these frequencies and know for sure whether the animal is able to hear. But obviously sentience, we're unable to do that because we don't have a direct measure. We don't really know what we're looking for. And so this is kind of difficult. So now I'm going to go kind of more deeply into what is required of these two roots. So the two roots are basically the two motivations that I've just spelled out. So for scientific knowledge, to know whether the agent is sentient. So how can we do that? So to do that, really the only way we can do that is by knowing the definitive requirements for sentience. So we need to know exactly what we need or what an agent would need in order to be sentient. And obviously consciousness research is trying to do this and has been trying to do this for a long time. And is currently not found the definitive requirements, but this route, taken at its most conservative level, can only be met by finding these requirements. So yeah, consciousness research is attempting to do this by looking into how humans are conscious and the neural mechanisms behind it, using behavior, fMRI, computational studies, and using model organisms like mice, like my postdoc is doing, basically, just trying to look at, can we find those requirements? Obviously, we haven't got there yet. And so the pathway kind of stops here. So the next point would be, does the agent fulfill these definitive requirements? But we don't have them, so we can't answer that. So we have no way currently of knowing 100% whether an agent is sentient or not. And again, we know this. This is a sort of simple route, but I'm just mapping it out to compare. So the consequences of not fulfilling this purpose is fairly minimal when you consider it just for the scientific knowledge's sake. So it means that we can't learn more about how consciousness has evolved or the neural mechanisms or which animals have it so that we can know which model organisms to use. But when it's considered completely independent of the societal purpose, the consequences are fairly minimal. But for the societal route, do we need these definitive requirements as well? So obviously, at the moment, we don't have the definitive requirements, but we have laws and social opinions about which animals, which agents are sentient, and whether it's bad to cause negative subjective experiences in these agents. So we have laws against murder and torture and animal cruelty. And yet we don't have the definitive requirements or any definitive proof that these agents are sentient or feeling bad when we do these things to them. And yet we have these laws because that's how society works. We need to. And so basically, my whole point here is that our current assessment is clearly not based on these definitive requirements, and it clearly doesn't need definitive requirements. And so really what it probably needs is potential requirements. We kind of go with probabilities of whether it's feeling something. And a lot of these are based on our instincts at the moment, but I'll get into that later. But basically, the point is we don't need the definitive requirements, we need potential requirements. And these will be influenced by consciousness research looking for the definitive requirements. But at the moment, this is all we need for this route. So consciousness research is, in a sense, already doing this. In looking for the definitive requirements, it's finding requirements that might be involved without being able to say 100% whether they are. And so here's an example of these being picked up by animal sentience research. But it's basically using consciousness research to inform which indicators might be potential indicators for sentience. So this is the Birch et al. Precautionary framework. I'll go into a little bit more later, but it's basically neural and behavioral criteria that are loosely based on the functional reasons, the functional mechanisms behind consciousness and informed by consciousness research into other animals and humans. And then researchers like Megan, for example, are also refining these criteria to try and come up with the best potential requirements possible, basically. And this is being done by a couple of researchers. And we're just trying to figure out the likelihood that these requirements are potential requirements and how likely are they. to be required for sentience. So then the next question is, now we have these, or once we have these potential requirements, then how much does the agent that we're assessing fulfill these? And this is what animal sentience work is currently doing. So this is work from Rethink Priorities, and this is just a representation of what they did, but it's basically using these potential requirements and weighting them and doing a big literature review to try and see which they fulfill. And that's a very basic overview of what they did, but basically it's seeing what is the probability that they fulfill these requirements, so you can see the overall probability of sentience in these animals. This has also been done in other ways, in other frameworks. So this is the Birch et al. Framework I was just talking about. And I've had to cut off this table because it didn't really fit, but it's just a sort of representation of the approach. So it's basically a review of the evidence of sentience in cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans, and using those criteria I showed earlier and doing a literature review of all of these animals and assessing how likely it is they fulfill each criteria, and then coming up with a sort of probability that the agent is sentient. And we, as in Megan and I and some others, also did this in insects using the same framework, basically doing the exact same thing and analyzing all the evidence for these criteria, and then trying to come up with the probability that each of these orders of insects were sentient. So our current progress with this route, obviously, the probability of sentient doesn't seem to be, the probability of sentience is not the only influence on our legislation and on our societal opinion. And the reason I say this is because if you look at these two slides, you can see that the evidence for sentience being very high in octopus, for example, versus in Diptera, which includes fruit flies, is actually lower. And yet lobsters and octopuses were considered sentient beings based on this report in the UK. And so, yeah, there are other reasons why this has happened. It was because the report was specifically for this law, and so obviously it was easier to influence it. But the sort of general point here is that it doesn't equal, like, the probability of sentience from science does not equal the legislation. And another example of this is the fact that octopuses are legally recognized in the UK, but not in the US, for example. And we know that that doesn't necessarily mean that octopuses are more sentient in the UK than in the US. So obviously there is a disconnect, and there is a consequence to these disconnects. And the other factors that are coming into it are obviously all of these things I mentioned earlier. And again, this is not exhaustive, but familiarity, culture, intelligence, cuteness, lots of other things are coming into this final, how should we treat them? How should we care about them? Not just the probability that the agent is sentient. So the consequences here are basically fairly large. So as I just explained, octopuses are only recognized in some countries. And so this, it might be a false negative, it might not be, but we don't know. And the point is, if it is a false negative, then octopuses are only being protected in some countries and not others. And this kind of, I've put distrust in science, which is a bit strong, but I think what I mean here is it also creates this idea that we don't really know how to assess things, and society and laws are not getting clear answers from animal sentience research about how much should we care, how much do they feel, how much treatment do they need. So here is basically some sort of ideas to amend what the approach we're taking here. So at the moment, these are being influenced, and obviously I've put massive crosses on here, which is very simplified. I'm not just saying we can just get rid of all of these biases, but it's an ideal representation of what we might do. So I basically think that we could maybe approach this in the way of including the probability that the agent is sentient, but not just going probability the agent is sentient and then that's how we should treat them. But we really should take into account how much we're influencing the agent. And that is kind of important for us as a society and our laws. And so the way I've illustrated this is like, would our laws and societal opinion change if tomorrow we were to find really good evidence that, say, a deep sea creature that we've never interacted with feels pain? Say we find really good evidence that a neural indicator or a gene is needed for sentience, and then we find out this deep sea creature we barely even know about has that. Do you think that we would suddenly then have laws protecting this deep sea creature? I think it's probably unlikely because of the amount we interact with it. And similarly, on the flip side, if we were to find fairly good evidence that dogs can't feel pain, would that mean that tomorrow everybody starts kicking their dogs? Probably not. So obviously, this is very simplified, but I think in general, a way to capture the things that are important to us, which, cuteness and intelligence and familiarity, all of these are biases, but it is kind of important to acknowledge that we have those and acknowledge that some of it comes from just how much influence we have over the animal, how much interaction we have with them. And those sort of go together a lot of the time. And so basically, what I'm proposing is that the probability of the agent being sentient is considered alongside how much we influence that agent and how much specifically we influence their subjective experiences. So in order to know this, we obviously need to know how much do we interact with the agent. So with the deep sea creature, for example, it would be not at all. And then how much would our interaction influence the agent's subjective experiences? So what our actions do and how they affect the animal. And animal welfare research is currently doing this path, basically. So this is where my approach kind of comes together. So this is how we have it at the moment, where this is what I've just explained, that probability of the agent being sentient is trying to be figured out by sentience research, and then the amount of influence we have is being figured out by welfare research. And then other factors like familiarity and cuteness are coming into it. And then in general, it's sort of the societal opinion that's influencing the laws. And this is very generalized because I just gave you an example of a report directly influencing the laws. But still, in general, this is kind of the way it goes. And then obviously, the other thing that comes into making laws is lawmaking trade-offs. And I just want to emphasize here that I'm not saying that we get rid of these. I'm not saying that we need to. So like how we should treat them does not equal how they must be treated. And this is a good example of this is the fact that most people at the moment, even in this current framework, might agree from societal opinions that pigs feel pain and pigs are able to feel pain. And all of this evidence kind of converges that the probability that pigs are sentient was pretty high. Other factors like we find them cute and they communicate with us is also pretty high. And the influence we have over them, i.e., killing them, is pretty high. So societal opinion basically says we should probably care about them, and yet we still kill them for food. And obviously, this is the lawmaking trade-off. So I'm not trying to say that the output of this assessment should be exactly how we treat them because other laws come into it and other considerations. And that's not really where I'm going with this. But so this is my improvement of the approach. Basically, the idea is that welfare research and sentience research should try and work together a little bit more in that we come up with the probability that the agent is sentient and then how much influence we have over them. And then I don't know if this would be the right framing or phrasing of this score, but some sort of duty score, how much we should be caring about the animal, how much we have influence over them, and how much we think that they are able to feel. And then that can influence societal opinion, and then laws can be made based on other things. So, for example, with pigs, this would still be the same thing that we have a high duty to pigs, and we think that pigs probably do feel pain. Societal opinion agrees, but the lawmaking trade-offs come into it, and we don't end up making those laws. And so I'm not suggesting an entire overhaul of how research is done. I think that these paths of research are basically already being made. And I need to sort of flesh out how this would actually work and how this would be implemented. But the basic idea is coming up with something that can come out of science that can be trusted as this is the probability that we think that we should care about this animal, if that makes sense. So just testing out this collaborative approach. and how it works with some test cases that I've brought up already. So this deep sea creature that in theory we know is probably likely to feel pain versus dogs not feeling pain. And again, this is entirely hypothetical and extremely hypothetical, but let's just see if it kind of fits with our intuitive assessment. And so a deep sea creature that we never interact with, in this example, we think that it is likely to feel pain. And so it has a high probability that it's sentient, but we never interact with it. So it's low on this score. And so our duty score and our societal opinion and our laws means that our laws probably wouldn't change. So it kind of fits. And similarly with dogs, even if we find out that it's low, the low probability that they feel pain, we influence them so much that we have quite a high duty towards them. And our laws, our societal opinion might change. So another example is with lab mice versus wild mice. So they're obviously the same animal, so they would have the same probability that the mouse is sentient, but the amount of influence that we have over the agent is what changes. And so our duty score and our laws should change based on the influence we have, and that is kind of how we have it already. We have ethical restrictions on how we treat lab mice, and we don't really on wild mice because of our lack of interaction with them. And then another very zoomed out example is just humans versus any other animal. We have a very high probability that humans are sentient. We influence other humans a lot more than any other animal, arguably. And then our duty score and our societal opinion score is quite high. So things like murder are classed as worse than animal cruelty. And again, kind of fits with our intuitive assessments. But importantly, it doesn't include things like cuteness and familiarity to us and things like that. So it kind of tries to get rid of these biases. It's a very idealistic approach, but that's sort of the idea. So how to implement it? So basically, the main sort of idea is to try and be really explicit that we want to keep the roots distinct. So that the aim of sentience research is not to prove that an animal is sentient, because that's the scientific knowledge gain route, not this route. So that's my first sort of main point. And I'm not really sure how this will be got across, but I think it's important to get it across. And I'm realizing lots of people think that there is a sort of a thing that we can test for and proves that something feels pain, and we don't have that. So we need to try and make it more obvious that these two routes are very distinct and different purposes. And this can be done, through animal sentience research being more explicit. I think at the moment, most research into animal sentience is explicit about this. But educating the public somehow it is really impossible to do this, because I think a lot of people think it's impossible to find it in insects, but it's not impossible to find it in mice, when actually it's kind of the same impossibility if we're taking it at face value. So yeah, on this note, being explicit about the aims of each bit of research. So if you're trying to look for the neural correlates, the limitations are we haven't got them yet. And if you're trying to look for sentience, we're just looking for the probabilities, and that's the explicit aim. So, and accepting that this uncertainty is inevitable is also a key thing. So we need to just be able to accept that we might never be able to find the definitive requirements, and yet laws still need to be made, decisions need to be made, and societal opinion needs to change or needs to be updated. And so this uncertainty is inevitable. And like I was just saying, educating people on this would be good. And then finally, for scientific knowledge, just the scientific knowledge route specifically, I think when you are considering it separately to the societal approach, I think it would probably be best to just start focusing on humans only. And at the moment, we don't, because of model organisms, but I think at the moment, humans are the only case where we can be fairly certain that we are sentient, or at least they are the highest probability. And so for the scientific knowledge gain, which is just the purpose, which is just specifically looking at the neural correlates or the neural requirements, the definitive requirements, we really need to start with somewhere that we have proof, or as much close as we can get to proof as possible. So that's just my suggestion specifically for that. So future directions. Obviously, his approach needs to be validated and needs to be fleshed out a little bit more and think about all of the other possibilities and things that come into it. But I think, yeah, basically what I did with the test cases before, but properly calculating the probability of the sentience and the amount of influence would be a good thing to do, a next step. I'm going to be working on that. And then obviously, we are already trying to do this with what I showed you with Megan and Bob Fisher's work, for example, improving the probability of the frameworks, improving the probability of sentience frameworks by refining the criteria and iteratively updating what's being found in consciousness research about trying to look for the definitive requirements and updating these. And this is an example of how sentience researchers are basically already doing this. This whole approach is already kind of being done. But I just think clarifying it is kind of needed. And so on that, I think that translating it into something usable is my next step because I don't really have a full idea of how to do that yet. So that's what I'm working on. But something that could be used by all different types of researchers and lawmakers and the public. It's quite idealistic, but a sort of general approach that could be used and could be adopted. So to conclude, I've basically outlined that there seems to be two purposes, and these two purposes for assessing sentience get mixed up a lot, and there are consequences to these getting mixed up. So I've also laid out how different types of research, like animal sentience research and animal welfare research, can come together and come into play, how these relate to consciousness research, looking for the definitive requirements, and how these can come into play to potentially come out with one score or come out with one answer about how we should be treating an animal, which then doesn't completely influence the law, but should be a clear answer coming directly from science. And clear delineation between these two is going to be helpful for science and society in the future. So I think that's it. I think I'm a bit early finishing, sorry, but yeah, that's my main talk.
Hi. Okay. Thank you so much for the talk. And we do have some questions. So if you're ready, I will just get started with some of those.
Sure.
So this first question is, how do you think your framework on duty would intersect with indirect effects? So, for example, we may have a much higher influence on wild mice than we think via climate change and other ecosystem level shifts that may influence their welfare.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I was thinking about this. Oh, how do I go back? I was thinking about this in this sort of part where how much do we interact with the agent? That is an entire question in itself. And I do think it could be taken to different extremes. Like you could just think, okay, how much do we actively directly affect the animal? Or you could think in terms of that. And I was thinking that with the deep sea creature as well. Like, are there things that we're doing that indirectly affect it? And so that is obviously a difficult question. And again, would have to be a probability or how much we think we interact and would be based on likelihoods as well. And same with how much would this interaction influence the agent. So I think that's a whole animal welfare research aim.
I guess a kind of follow up to that, when we think about the legal systems, and neither you nor I are a legal scholar. I appreciate that. When I think of legal systems as a non-legal scholar, I tend to think of them as at least currently kind of moderating more direct effects than indirect effects, where we largely seem to be trying to mediate how a person treats a specific organism directly. Do you think this may be that your framework suggests there should be a larger shift in how these sorts of legal systems are designed to account better for those indirect effects?
I think that it would probably depend on how much the indirect effects affect the subjective experiences. That's kind of what I'm trying to bake in with this times how much the interaction influences the specific subjective experiences. So it really would probably depend on how much the indirect effect affects that. And again, it's extremely hard to tell. But in general, I think, at least with the cases I've been through theoretically in my own mind, it kind of lines up fairly similarly with how we're already doing a lot of things. Um, yeah, so, it wouldn't necessarily mean that we should suddenly start making laws about animals that we only indirectly affect. I don't think.
Okay, so we have another question here about, talking about the public distrust of science and the kind of, impacts of the public distrust of science on how some of these frameworks might be used. So Maria asks, why not advocate borrowing the standard, at least in US law, for expert testimony, where the expert witness need not say definitively yes or no, but rather to testify to a reasonable degree of professional certainty?
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't know if you're referring to specifically the like sort of science in general, coming out and saying that. I think that's what you're saying. And I think I kind of agree. I guess maybe what you're saying is putting a threshold onto where this probability needs to be in order, plus the amount of influence in order for it to be considered as a duty, which I think is actually a really good point. I might think about including something like that. Just gonna make a note of it.
So we have another question here by Mitch. So Mitch is saying, I'm less familiar with sentience, but more with consciousness research. Schools in consciousness research tend to view consciousness not as an all or none phenomenon, but as a quantitative phenomenon, like almost everything in biology. Therefore, the question of sentience in insects will not be answered in an all or none fashion. You will be left with having to define a threshold, which will always remain ambiguous. What are your thoughts?
Um, I'm not sure because I think with the example of hearing, for example, we never really defined a threshold of if an animal is able to respond to sound and they have the same neural activity as us or whatever, then that means that they hear. We sort of just accepted the uncertainty and like pushed that to one side and we were like, they can hear or they can't hear and they can hear to this frequency or whatever. Very simply put. Um, but yeah, I mean, I guess what you're saying is it's not going to be the probability the agent is sentient, but it's the probability of the amount of their sentience or how much they are able to be sentient, which I think is a good point, and I should think about how that fits in to the framework. I think it probably kind of fits fairly well with the probability that the agent is sentient, though. Like that's trying to include the level, if that makes sense. So it's kind of trying to view it as relative to humans in a way, because that's how we're defining sentience. Sentience is something that we have made up and designed. So yeah, I'll think about that. Thank you.
Another question from Liz. Do you think that your schema would be appropriate for AI sentience as well?
Yeah, I mean, as you can see in my diagram, I already have AI in there. This was meant to be designed for any agent that we would be assessing sentience in. So yes, I haven't gone through examples of AI, but I am planning on doing that and seeing whether these fit. I think in general, it pretty much is the same. So, we'll be able to come up with a probability. We'll be able to, the requirements are basically the same. And we'll be able to figure out how much influence we have. So yeah, I think that it's pretty compatible. I think you just put, instead of animal sentience research, you put AI sentience and AI welfare.
Another question from Jesse. So, I think coming up with a duty score based on evidence for influence and sentience would be helpful for our fields to direct future research and focus our efforts. How do you think you could approach the public with this duty score that would make them in turn influence legislation? I feel that creating more familiarity and relatability for animals that aren't cute might be a better way to get the public on board rather than cutting those things out of the picture and presenting them with a number.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, so there's kind of two questions there. Like, how do you get people to care about the duty score? Um, I don't know. I'm going to think about it and think about how I don't even know if duty score is the right phrasing really, but the idea is to try and come up with a more accessible term than sentience. With sentience, you have to know what it is and how we're not able to find it and all of this. Whereas if there's some score that science can give us, this is important, or they probably feel they're similar to us or whatever, then that's kind of the aim. And yeah, when it comes to convincing people to care about that score, I think that's a really good point, that influencing the cuteness and the intelligence and the communication and stuff is definitely quite influential. And I've seen that in my own work where people, they don't necessarily care that much about fruit flies, but they care a lot about bumblebees because they're cute and we interact with them more. And it's definitely a effective way of doing it. I just don't think scientifically it's a good way. So it's like influencing things that we don't want to be influenced. But yeah, that's kind of why I was trying to think of the interaction that we have with the animal, the amount of influence we have, because usually those two come hand in hand. So we usually, the more we interact with an animal, and this is generalized, but the more people interact with animals, the more they think that they're cute. And so that's how it's happened with bumblebees and with bees in general. Like once you learn more about an animal and the behaviors and you understand it more, it becomes cute. And I've had the same experience where I've worked with maggots and I hated maggots at the start, and then I suddenly found them cute when I was looking at them under a microscope and working with them all the time. And so I think that that's trying to capture that without explicitly capturing what is already cute to a human.
Another question, would it be appropriate to use insect consciousness and welfare research to design or promote approaches that are less painful to insects in agriculture, like reducing pesticides, making them kill the insects faster, etc., and also reducing the indirect effects such as climate change?
Sorry, could you read the beginning of the question again?
Yes. Would it be appropriate to use insect consciousness and welfare research to design and promote approaches that are less painful to insects in agriculture and reducing indirect effects such as climate change?
Yeah, I think so. I think that fits pretty well with this framework. So looking at insect sentience and insect welfare would, directly affect these two things, and then the outcome would be this, which then obviously there are other things that need to affect the law based on that, which is what I went into a little bit earlier. Um, but yeah, I think that that is sort of the aim, that if we get a more clear ending, so wait, I'm on the wrong slide, aren't I? Yeah. If we get a more clear duty score, then things like agriculture can be affected by that and using them in research.
So our next question, I think, is partially about like welfare trade-offs among species and also about naturalness of different behaviors. So David is asking, in interaction with agents, how would you consider making insects available for poultry or fish feed? This is a natural phenomenon, but perhaps at a changed scale. Where do you think we'll get to in understanding the subjective experiences of these animals?
Yeah, that's a really good example of an indirect effect, actually. Well, actually, it's not really indirect, but something that would be happening, but we increase. That's a good point. So yeah, again, then would be this animal welfare research trying to look into what influence we have over the agent's subjective experiences there, which is already what is trying to be done when it comes to insect farming. So basically already what we're doing. And the idea is that in theory, the amount of influence we're having over the agent's subjective experiences, in order to find that out, you don't need to know the probability of the agent's subjective experiences. So it's animal welfare research would be assuming that they are able to feel something, and then animal sentience research would be figuring out the probability that that's true, and then they would be taking each other into account. And so something like feeding insects, you would need to find out how much we're doing that. So I think it was on a different slide where I had the two factors that come into it, how much we're doing that, how much that is likely to affect if they feel pain, how much pain would they be in. Those two things would then feed into that. And it would really depend on probably the scale. So yeah.
Okay, one last question for you. We have so many questions. It's great that people are so excited about this talk. So this question is from Bob. I'm wondering how you think about the relationship between what you're saying and Birch's idea that our responsibilities are based on what's proportionate to the risk.
Sorry, I don't know if that's my
I'm,
connection. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I can hear you now. Sorry, I lost you then.
Okay, let me start over. Um, so this is Bob. He's wondering how you think about the relationship between what you're saying and Birch's idea that our responsibilities are based on what's proportionate to the risk. So this isn't really an issue for welfare science to assess. It's for stakeholders to determine in conversation with welfare scientists and ethicists. How different then are these proportionality assessments from your version of duty scores?
Okay, so just so I understand it, you're saying that the proportion of risk, that would probably be, oh, wait, let me share my screen again. I hope this doesn't, I stopped it to try and get the signal better, but hopefully this doesn't crash it. Um, so I think, were you saying that the proportion of risk, that would basically be the probability that the agent is sentient? I mean, it's basically similar to the duty score. And then I think you were saying that Jonathan's arguing that that is how laws should be made. Is that what you were saying? Sorry,
It says Birch's idea is that our responsibilities are based on what's proportionate to the risk. And then the question is, how different is Birch's idea of a proportionality assessment from your version of a duty score?
okay, yeah. I mean, I feel like it's probably pretty similar. I think it's just this maybe this gap here that I've tried to not touch, where it's the lawmaking trade-offs. I honestly, yeah, like you just said earlier, I'm not a legal scholar, and so I haven't been trying to interact with what we do after we know the proportion, or the proportionate risk. So I guess that's what he's arguing there, that it should be based on the proportionate risk. And I think in reality, the proportionate risk is pretty similar to the duty score in that
Okay.
framework as I've understood it. But I need to look into that.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I will call it here because we had lots of great questions and lots of great answers. For anybody who is interested, this talk has been recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel sometime this week. Also, we do have another seminar coming up next month that you can find listed on our insectwelfare.com/research seminar page. And that one is going to be looking at horseshoe crabs and they're harvesting their blood for use in medical trials. So we'll be getting a great talk about that by Christoph Whitney next month. Let's all just thank Tilda one more time so much for coming and giving us this great talk. Hopefully you got lots of feedback that was helpful, and I look forward to seeing more about the project. Thank
Cool.
you,
Thank
Tilda.
you so much. And thanks for everyone for their questions.